The hall went silent the moment Damien stood up and pulled another woman into the seat meant for his wife. Elena Voss froze at the edge of the long table, a cup of wine still warm in her hand, watching the man she had married stand in front of 300 pack members and place his palm on the small of a stranger's back. The woman was young, dressed in deep red, her dark hair curled and pinned the way brides wore it on their wedding night. She smiled at the crowd like she already owned it. "Tonight," Damien said, his voice carrying easily across the great hall of Blackthorn Manor, "I want you all to welcome someone who will be very important to this pack's future." Nobody moved, nobody breathed. Elena felt every eye in the room slide toward her, then back toward him, then back toward her again, like the whole hall was watching a fight before the first blow had even landed. She was still Luna. She was still his wife, and he was standing there introducing his mistress, as if Elena were a piece of furniture nobody needed to consult. "Celine has given me something I have waited 5 years for," Damien continued, and the words hit the room like a slap. "She is carrying my child, my heir." A ripple of gasps moved through the crowd, quiet at first, then louder as people turned to whisper to their neighbors. Elena's hand tightened around her cup until her knuckles went white. She did not drop it. She did not let her face crack. 5 years of pack politics had taught her exactly one thing: the moment you show pain in front of wolves, you become prey. She set the cup down slowly on the table, the sound sharp in the sudden quiet. Damien looked at her then, finally, as if remembering she was still in the room. There was no guilt in his eyes, no shame, only a kind of cold satisfaction, like a man who had won an argument he'd been having with her for years without ever saying a word out loud. "Elena," he said, using her name the way a stranger would, "I think it's time we were honest with the pack about where things stand between us." She could have screamed. She could have thrown the cup at his head and watched the crystal shatter against his perfect jaw. Instead, she smiled. It was small, and it did not reach her eyes, but it was steady, and that steadiness was the only weapon she had left, in a room full of people who had just watched her be replaced, in front of everyone she had spent 5 years trying to protect. "How honest would you like to be, Damien?" she asked, and her voice did not shake, not once. He blinked, caught off guard by her calm. He had expected tears. He had expected her to run from the hall, humiliated, giving him the dramatic scene he could later use to paint her as unstable, as unfit, as someone the pack should be relieved to see replaced. She refused to give him that. "I think everyone here can see for themselves," he said instead, gesturing at Celine, who placed a protective hand over her still flat stomach, as if the whole pack needed to be reminded what was growing inside her. Elena let her eyes travel slowly across the hall. She saw Marta, the eldest pack elder, staring at her plate, unwilling to meet anyone's gaze. She saw young warriors who had trained under her, exchanging uneasy glances, unsure whether loyalty to their alpha meant staying silent while their Luna was publicly discarded. She saw the healers, the mothers, the children too young to understand what was happening, but old enough to feel the tension pressing down on the room like a physical weight. And she saw, near the back of the hall, half hidden by a pillar, the one person whose face held no smugness and no confusion. Ruth, the pack's oldest healer and the only person who knew Elena's real secret, met her eyes for exactly 1 second. In that second, Ruth gave the smallest shake of her head. "Not yet. Don't do anything rash. Not here." Elena understood. She had learned patience the hard way, in a marriage built on politics instead of love, in a household where every kindness from her husband had turned out to be a transaction. She could wait 1 more hour. She had already waited 5 years. "Congratulations," Elena said finally, turning back to Damien and Celine. Her voice was clear enough to carry to the back of the hall. "I hope the child brings the pack everything it needs." The words landed strangely, not quite the collapse Damien had been hoping for, and something flickered across his face, brief and uncertain, gone before anyone else could notice it. He had wanted a broken woman. He had gotten a woman who simply agreed with him, and then reached for her wine again, as if the announcement of his mistress's pregnancy was no more important than a comment about the weather. Celine, for her part, seemed less prepared for this than Damien was. She had clearly expected tears, or rage, or a scene that would let her step fully into the role of the wronged woman standing beside a man who had chosen her. Instead, she got silence. and silence from Elena Voss had always unsettled people who did not know her well. Celine's smile faltered for just a moment, before she forced it back into place. "I only want what's best for the pack," Celine said, a little too loudly, a little too quickly, as if reciting a line she had practiced. "Of course you do," Elena replied, and there was something in her tone, something so calm and so final, that even Damien felt a small chill move down his spine, though he would never have admitted it. The feast resumed, awkwardly at first, then with the forced normalcy of people who did not know what else to do. Musicians who had gone quiet during the announcement began playing again. Servers moved between tables refilling cups nobody wanted refilled. Conversations picked back up in low, careful tones, everyone talking about anything except what had just happened, while somehow talking about nothing else at all. Elena sat through another hour of it. She ate nothing. She drank nothing more. She watched Damien laugh with Celine at his side, watched him accept congratulations from pack members too afraid of his temper to withhold them, watched the woman who was carrying his supposed heir preen under the attention like she had already won a war. Elena hadn't realized they were fighting. But Elena knew something none of them did, something that made the entire spectacle almost pathetic in its arrogance. She excused herself just after midnight, telling the nearest elder that she had a headache and needed rest. Nobody questioned it. Nobody even really looked at her. She had become, in the space of one evening, someone the pack had already started forgetting. She walked the long corridor back to her private chambers with her spine straight and her chin level, refusing to let her shoulders slump until she was certain no one could see her. Only when the heavy oak door clicked shut behind her did she allow herself to lean against it, eyes closed, chest rising and falling too fast. The chambers were quiet, except for the soft, familiar sound of 2 small heartbeats. Elena crossed the room to the hidden nursery behind the false wall of her wardrobe, the one only she and Ruth knew existed, sealed by a concealment charm that hid not just the room but the scent and sound of what lived inside it. She pressed her palm against the wood, whispered the words Ruth had taught her, and the wall shifted silently aside. Inside, in twin cradles carved from pale wood, her children slept. A boy and a girl, 4 months old, with Damien's storm-gray eyes and her own dark hair, born in secret in a cabin 2 territories away, delivered by Ruth alone, hidden from the pack, hidden from Damien, hidden from everyone who might use them as leverage in the war for power that had been quietly building around the throne for over a year. Damien did not know his true heirs already existed. He believed, like everyone else in that hall tonight, that Elena had never been able to give him a child, that her body had failed the one duty Elena was expected to fulfill. He had used that belief as a weapon against her for months, a quiet, constant reminder of her inadequacy, before finally turning to Celine to solve the problem in front of the entire pack. He had no idea what he had actually done tonight. He had no idea that the woman he had just humiliated in front of hundreds of witnesses held, in a hidden room behind her own wardrobe, the only legitimate bloodline capable of inheriting the Blackthorn throne. Elena knelt beside the cradles and touched her son's small hand, then her daughter's, feeling the tension in her chest ease slightly at the warmth of their skin. "You are safe," she whispered. "Whatever happens next, you are safe." She had known, for months now, that this night, or one like it, was coming. Damien's affair with Celine had stopped being a secret from Elena a long time before it became public knowledge to the pack. She had watched him grow colder, more distant, more willing to let Celine attend council meetings that should have belonged to Eluna. She had watched the elders start to whisper about succession, about whether the Alpha King needed an heir badly enough to set his wife aside entirely. What none of them knew was that Elena had spent those same months preparing. She had used her position to quietly study pack law with an intensity nobody thought to question, learning exactly what rights Eluna held, exactly what protections existed for Eluna's children, exactly what happened to a pack's magic when its true bloodline was denied its place. She had built relationships outside Blackthorn territory, careful and discreet, with allies who owed her favors from years of diplomatic work Damien had barely noticed her doing. She had trained her body in ways a pampered Luna was never expected to train, learning to fight, to track, to survive outside the safety of palace walls, because some instinct deep inside her had warned that safety inside those walls would not last forever. Tonight had confirmed everything that instinct had been telling her. Ruth arrived at the chamber door 20 minutes later, slipping inside without knocking, her healer's satchel already in her hand. "You held yourself together better than I expected," Ruth said quietly, crossing to check on the sleeping twins, with the practiced efficiency of someone who had delivered hundreds of pack children over 4 decades. "I had practice," Elena said. 5 years of it." Ruth's eyes softened, but she did not offer false comfort, and Elena was grateful for that. Ruth had never been the type to smooth things over with kind lies. "They will come looking for a reason eventually," Ruth said. "Celine's child will not carry true alpha magic. No matter what Damien believes right now, the pack's wards respond to bloodline, not to declarations made at a feast. When the wards begin to weaken, people will start asking questions." "I know," Elena said. She had known this before Ruth said it, had run the calculations 100 times in her own mind, during long nights unable to sleep. Blackthorn's protective magic was ancient, tied directly to legitimate succession, woven into the land itself centuries ago. A child born outside a true mating bond, without the alpha bloodline running properly through both parents, could never activate that magic no matter what title Damien gave the child. Celine's baby, whoever fathered it, whatever Damien believed about it tonight in front of his cheering hall, would never be able to protect this pack the way the land required. "How long do we have?" Elena asked. "Before the wards visibly weaken?" "Months, perhaps. Pack magic fades slowly, like a fire starved of fuel, rather than doused all at once." Ruth straightened, folding a soft blanket more securely around the sleeping girl. "But Elena, that is not truly what I meant, when I asked what you intend to do." Elena looked at her old friend for a long moment, and something settled in her chest, a decision she realized she had already made, somewhere between the moment Damien stood up at that table and the moment she knelt down beside these cradles. "I'm leaving," she said quietly, "tonight, before dawn." Ruth did not look surprised. If anything, she looked relieved, as though she had been waiting weeks for Elena to say those exact words out loud. "Where will you go?" "Somewhere he'll never think to look," Elena said. "Somewhere I can raise them without a crown hanging over their heads before they can even walk. Somewhere I can decide, on my own terms, whether they ever come back to claim what's theirs." "And if he comes after you?" Elena's jaw tightened, and for the first time since the feast, something colder than sorrow moved into her expression, something that looked almost like the calm, before a much bigger storm, than the one that had already passed through the great hall tonight. "Then he'll find a woman who is nothing like the one he humiliated at that table," she said. "He built me into someone quiet, someone patient, someone he thought he could set aside without consequence. He has no idea what that patience was building toward." Ruth reached out and squeezed Elena's hand, a rare gesture of open affection, from a woman who usually kept her emotions carefully guarded. "Then let's get you and these children somewhere safe before he wakes up tomorrow and realizes exactly what he lost tonight." They moved quickly after that, packing only what was essential. Essential documents Elena had secretly copied months earlier. Proof of the twins' birth witnessed and sealed by Ruth herself. Enough coin and supplies to survive the journey ahead, and warm blankets to wrap around 2 sleeping infants who had no idea their entire lives were about to change before the sun rose. Elena paused only once, at the threshold of the bedroom she had shared with Damien for 5 years, looking back at the space that had once held whatever hope she'd carried into this marriage, as a young woman who believed, foolishly, that duty could grow into love if given enough time. She left the wedding ring on the nightstand. Then she walked out into the cold night air, with her children held close against her chest, Ruth beside her carrying supplies, and the ancient forest of Blackthorn territory opening up before them like a door swinging wide for the first time in years. Behind her, in the palace she was leaving forever, the feast was finally winding down, servants clearing tables, guests stumbling home through torchlit corridors, and Damien Blackthorn falling asleep beside his mistress, with no idea that the true future of his pack had just slipped silently through his own gates, carried in the arms of the wife he had thrown away in front of everyone who mattered. By the time anyone noticed she was gone, she would already be somewhere he could not touch her. And the message she left, carved into the palace gate, cut deep enough that no one could later claim it had been overlooked, would say everything she needed it to say, in words simple enough for even Damien to finally understand what he had done. You buried what you didn't deserve. The sun would rise in a few hours over a pack that had no idea its entire future had just walked out into the dark, and an alpha king, who was about to learn that some mistakes cannot be undone with an apology, no matter how powerful the man making it believes himself to be. Damien Blackthorne woke to the sound of pounding on his chamber door, before the sun had fully cleared the horizon, and something in the urgency of that sound told him, even before he opened his eyes, that whatever waited on the other side would not be good news. Alpha King. The voice belonged to Garrick, captain of the palace guard, and it carried an edge Damien had rarely heard from a man usually calm under pressure. You need to come see the front gate, now. Beside him, Celine stirred, blinking against the early light, one hand instinctively moving to rest over her stomach. Damien barely glanced at her as he pulled on a shirt and crossed to the door, irritation already building at being disturbed so early, after a long night of celebration. This had better be important, Garrick. It's Elena, Garrick said, and something in the way he said her name made Damien's stomach tighten in a way he did not expect and did not appreciate. She's gone. Damien's first reaction was almost relief. Of course she was gone. She had been humiliated in front of the entire pack, and running to lick her wounds somewhere quiet was exactly what he had expected a proud woman like Elena to do. He had assumed she would take a few days at her family's old estate, perhaps, and return once she'd composed herself, once she'd accepted the new reality of their marriage. Let her go wherever she needs to go, Damien said, already turning back toward his chamber. She'll return when she's ready. Sir, Garrick's voice stopped him cold. You don't understand. There's a message carved into the front gate. And her personal chambers, the guards who checked this morning, found something you need to see for yourself. Something in his captain's tone made the irritation in Damien's chest curdle into something closer to unease. He followed Garrick down the long corridor, through the entrance hall still littered with the remains of last night's feast, servants moving quietly to clean up wine stains and scattered flower petals, all of them going silent and avoiding eye contact as their Alpha King strode past. The front gate of Blackthorne Manor stood 20 feet tall, ancient oak reinforced with iron, older than the current bloodline itself. Carved deep into the wood, fresh enough that pale splinters still curled at the edges of each letter, were 7 words that made Damien's blood run cold the moment he read them. You buried what you didn't deserve. He stared at the message for a long moment, his mind refusing to process it properly. It felt like a riddle, something cryptic and dramatic, the kind of thing a heartbroken woman might carve in a fit of anger, before disappearing to nurse her pride somewhere private. He almost laughed, the tension in his chest wanting release, in the form of dismissal, of mockery. Then Garrick led him to Elena's private chambers, and the laughter died before it ever reached his throat. The wardrobe stood open, and behind it, where solid walls should have been, gaped a hidden room Damien had never known existed in the 5 years he had lived in this house as her husband. 2 small cradles sat empty inside, blankets still faintly warm, the unmistakable scent of infant skin lingering in the air, along with something else, something that made every hair on Damien's body rise at once. Pack magic. Old, strong, unmistakably alpha bloodline pack magic, radiating faintly from a room he had never once suspected existed behind his own wife's wardrobe. What? Damien said slowly, each word costing him more effort than the last. Is this room? Garrick, to his credit, did not flinch from the answer, though Damien could see how badly he wanted to. Sir, we believe the Luna gave birth, some months ago, judging by the size of what's been left behind. Twins, from the look of the 2 cradles. The room tilted slightly around Damien, the way it might if someone had struck him and he hadn't yet registered the blow. Twins. Elena had given birth to twins, and hidden them, and he had spent the last several months telling anyone who would listen that his wife was barren, that she had failed her one essential duty as Luna, that he was fully justified in seeking an heir elsewhere. That's not possible, he said, though even as the words left his mouth, he could feel the certainty of them crumbling. She would have told me. She would have. With respect, sir, Garrick said carefully, given what happened at the feast last night, perhaps she had reasons not to. Damien said nothing to that. There was nothing to say. He stood in the doorway of a hidden nursery in his own home, staring at empty cradles that still smelled faintly of 2 children he hadn't known existed until this exact moment. Children whose scent carried the unmistakable weight of true pack magic, the kind that Celine's baby, whoever its father truly was, would never be able to produce. The realization hit him in pieces, each one worse than the last. If those children were his, if they were true-born alpha heirs carrying legitimate Blackthorn bloodline, then he had stood up in front of his entire pack last night and declared Celine's child his heir, while his actual heirs slept in a hidden room 50 feet away. He had humiliated the mother of his true children in front of hundreds of witnesses, in a display so public and so cruel that the elders were already whispering about it this morning, judging by the careful way none of the servants would meet his eyes. And now she was gone. All three of them were gone, and with them, whatever legitimate claim to the future Blackthorn Manor's protective magic actually required. "Search the territory," Damien said, his voice coming out rougher than he intended. "Every road, every border crossing, every safe house within a day's ride. I want her found." "Sir, if I may," Garrick said carefully. "The message on the gate. It doesn't read like a woman running from shame. It reads like a woman making a statement. I don't think she plans to be found easily." Damien turned on his captain with a look sharp enough to make even a seasoned guard take half a step back, but the anger drained out of him almost as quickly as it rose, replaced by something colder and far more uncomfortable: doubt. And beneath the doubt, something he hadn't expected to feel at all in this moment, the first cold edge of real fear. He walked back through the manor in a fog, past servants who quickly found reasons to be elsewhere, past the great hall still bearing the wreckage of last night's celebration, until he reached the council chamber, where the pack elders had already begun to gather, summoned by whispers that traveled faster than any formal announcement ever could. Marta, the eldest among them, rose the moment he entered, her expression carefully neutral in the way of someone who has decided not to show their true feelings until they understand exactly how dangerous the room has become. "Alpha King," she said, "we need to discuss what happened last night, and what appears to have happened this morning." "There is nothing to discuss," Damien said, though the words felt hollow even to him. "My wife has left. She'll return." "With respect," Marta said, and there was steel underneath the careful courtesy of her tone. "Your wife did not merely leave, Alpha King. According to what the guards have found, she left with 2 children this pack did not know existed. Children who, if the scent traces are accurate, carry legitimate alpha bloodline." The room went very quiet. Damien looked around at the assembled elders, men and women who had watched him grow from a pup into the leader of this pack, and saw in their faces a question he had never once expected to see directed at him: whether he was still fit to lead it. "I did not know," he said finally, the admission tasting like ash in his mouth. "I did not know she had given birth." "And yet you stood before this entire pack," said Eldrick, another elder, his voice tight with barely controlled anger, "and declared a child conceived outside your marriage bond to be your heir. While your true heirs, born of your Luna, existed in secret in this very house." "I didn't know," Damien repeated, louder this time, frustration bleeding into his voice. "Perhaps," Marta said quietly, "you should have asked before making such declarations in front of the entire pack, Alpha King. Perhaps you should have wondered why your Luna, a woman known for her patience and her devotion to this pack's well-being, had grown so distant these last months. Perhaps the answer was closer than you were willing to look." Damien had no response to that, because there was no response that would not sound like an excuse, and excuses had never been his strength even when he'd had a legitimate case to make. He had not asked Elena why she had grown quiet. He had not wondered what secrets might be hiding behind her calm exterior. He had been too consumed by his own frustration, his own sense of entitlement to an heir, his own growing relationship with Celine, to look closely enough at the woman he had married to notice she was carrying 2 children he had helped create. "What happens now?" he asked, and for the first time in years, his voice carried genuine uncertainty, rather than the practiced confidence of a man used to command. Marta exchanged a look with the other elders before answering, and something about that shared glance told Damien this conversation had been happening among them long before he'd walked into the room. "Now," she said, "we wait to see what the wards do. Pack magic is tied to legitimate bloodline, Alpha King, as you well know. If your true heirs have left this territory, the protective magic bound to this land may begin to weaken. It has happened before, in other packs, when succession has been improperly handled. It will not happen quickly, but it will happen, unless the situation is corrected. Corrected how? Bring your Luna home, Marta said simply. Bring your true heirs home. Whatever arrangement you have made with Celine, whatever comfort you have found there, none of it changes the fact that this pack's future depends on legitimate bloodline, not on declarations made at a feast. You built a house on sand last night, Alpha King, and the tide is already coming in. Damien left the council chamber with those words echoing in his ears, and for the first time since he had taken his father's place as Alpha King 8 years earlier, he felt something he had rarely allowed himself to feel. The genuine possibility that he had made a mistake large enough to cost him everything. He found Celine in her chambers, sitting by the window, her expression carefully composed, in a way that suggested she had already heard some version of the morning's events from the servants who moved through the manor, faster than any official news ever traveled. "Is it true?" she asked without preamble. "She had children? Your children?" "It appears so," Damien said, unable to keep the rawness out of his voice. Celine was quiet for a long moment, her hand resting over her own stomach, in a gesture that suddenly felt less like maternal instinct and more like a woman calculating her position in a rapidly shifting political landscape. "What does that mean for us?" she asked finally. Damien looked at her, really looked at her, for what felt like the first time in months, and saw not the woman he had convinced himself he loved, but someone who had known exactly what she was doing when she agreed to sit at that table last night, exactly what kind of public spectacle her presence would create. "I don't know," he said honestly, "but I intend to find out where Elena went, and when I do, I intend to bring my children home." "And me?" Celine asked, and for the first time, real uncertainty crept into her voice. Damien did not answer that question, because he did not yet know the answer himself, and standing in that room with the morning light falling across a woman whose pregnancy he had once believed would secure his legacy, he found himself thinking, for the first time in a very long while, about the wife he had spent 5 years failing to truly see. By midday, search parties had been dispatched along every major road leading away from Blackthorn territory, trackers hired from allied packs, messages sent to border patrols asking them to report any sighting of a woman traveling with 2 infants. Damien threw every resource available to him into the search, driven by a mixture of guilt, fear, and a stubborn refusal to accept that Elena had truly outmaneuvered him. But as the sun set on the second day, and no trace of her had been found, not a single sighting, not a single clue beyond the message carved into his gate, Damien began to understand something that settled into his chest like a stone. Elena had not left in a panic. She had not fled in shame or desperation. She had planned this, carefully and quietly, for longer than he wanted to consider, and she had done it well enough that even his best trackers found nothing but cold trails and empty roads. Somewhere out there, his true heirs were growing up without him, protected by a woman he had underestimated in every way that mattered, and the pack he had inherited was beginning, ever so slightly, to feel the first cracks in the magic that held it together. He stood at his window that night, staring out at the dark forest beyond the manor walls, and for the first time since he had become Alpha King, Damien Blackthorn felt genuinely, completely afraid of what he had lost. 3 weeks after Elena disappeared, the first crack in the border wards appeared near the eastern edge of Blackthorn territory, and it appeared exactly where the elders had warned it would. A young patrol officer named Colin was the one who noticed it first, a faint shimmer in the air along the tree line that should have felt solid and unbroken, the kind of protective barrier he had grown up trusting his entire life, without ever questioning how it worked. When he reached out and pressed his palm against the space where the ward should have hummed with familiar energy, he felt nothing but empty air where resistance used to be. He reported it immediately, and within hours, 3 more sections of border wall were found to be thinning in similar ways, patches of magic, growing threadbare like fabric, worn down by years of use, though the wards themselves were centuries old and had never shown this kind of weakness before. Damien rode out personally to inspect the damage, standing at the edge of his own territory, with his hand pressed against the same spot Colin had found, feeling for himself the unmistakable absence of the protection that had kept Blackthorn safe from rival packs for generations. "How long until this becomes a real problem?" he asked Marta, who had accompanied him, along with 2 other elders, skilled in the old magic that bound Packland to Pack bloodline. Weeks, perhaps, Marta said, her expression grim. A month if we're fortunate. The wards will not collapse all at once, Alpha King. They will fade slowly, section by section, until enough of the border becomes vulnerable that any pack with enough ambition and enough numbers could walk through without resistance. And there's nothing to be done? No way to reinforce it artificially? Not without legitimate bloodline actively present within the territory to anchor the magic, Marta said. The wards were never meant to function on declaration alone, Alpha King. They respond to truth, not to titles. You cannot simply announce an heir and expect centuries-old magic to accept the lie. Damien said nothing, staring out at the forest beyond the weakening ward, thinking of 2 children he had never met, sleeping somewhere beyond his reach, carrying within them the only thing capable of saving the pack he had spent his entire life being trained to protect. Word of the failing wards spread through Blackthorn territory faster than Damien could control, despite his attempts to keep the details quiet within the council. Pack members were not foolish. They could feel the subtle wrongness in the air near the borders, the way predators sense a storm coming long before the first clouds appear on the horizon. Whispers moved through the training grounds, through the market square, through every corner of the territory, whispers that all led back to the same conclusion. The Luna was gone, and with her, the pack's protection. Celine, for her part, grew increasingly withdrawn as the weeks passed, spending most of her days confined to her chambers, avoiding the pointed looks she received whenever she ventured into the common areas of the manor. Damien visited her out of habit more than genuine desire, and each visit felt more strained than the last, the easy affection that had once existed between them curdling into something closer to obligation on his part and quiet resentment on hers. "They blame me," Celine said one evening, sitting by her window with the same posture she'd held the day the search parties first went out, as if she had simply frozen in that position and never truly moved forward since. "Every time I walk through the halls, I can feel it. They think I destroyed this pack." "You didn't destroy anything," Damien said, though the words came out flatter than he intended, lacking the conviction they would have carried a month earlier. "Didn't I?" Celine turned to look at him, and there was something sharp in her eyes that he hadn't noticed before, something that made him wonder, not for the first time, exactly how much of their relationship had been genuine affection and how much had been calculated ambition on her part. "You stood up in front of the entire pack and called my child your heir, before I had even carried it past the first trimester safely. You did that, Damien, not me. I only sat where you told me to sit." The accusation stung precisely because it held truth in it, and Damien found himself with no good response, standing silently in her chamber, while the distance between them grew wider with every passing day. It was during the 4th week that the first real crisis arrived, delivered not through the failing wards directly, but through a messenger from the northern border, a young wolf named Peter, who arrived at the manor gates half-collapsed from exhaustion, having run the entire distance without stopping. "Rogue wolves," he gasped out to the guards who caught him before he fell. "Coming through the eastern gap, a dozen at least, maybe more. They know the wards are thin there." Damien mobilized his forces within the hour, gathering every able warrior the pack could spare, and riding hard for the eastern border, the same stretch of weakened ward Colin had first discovered weeks earlier. What they found when they arrived was chaos, a group of rogue wolves, opportunistic and violent, testing the thin barrier, and finding it gave way far more easily than any border should. The fight that followed was brutal but brief, Damien's trained warriors far outmatching the disorganized rogues in both skill and numbers, but the encounter left a lasting impression on everyone present. The wards that had protected Blackthorn territory for generations, that pack members had grown up trusting completely, had failed for the first time in living memory, and everyone who fought that night understood exactly why. "This is only the beginning," Aldrich warned Damien afterward, as they stood surveying the damaged section of border, warriors tending to minor wounds around them. "Word travels fast among rival packs, Alpha King. Once they understand Blackthorn's protection has weakened, more will come, larger groups, better organized. We cannot hold this border indefinitely on strength alone if the wards continue to fail." Damien understood the truth in that warning better than he wanted to admit. Blackthorn's reputation had always rested on 2 pillars, the strength of its warriors and the near impenetrable protection of its ancient wards. Losing the second pillar meant the first would eventually be tested past its limits, no matter how skilled his fighters were. He needed Elena back. He needed his true heirs back. And with every day that passed without a single trace of where she had gone, that need grew more desperate and more impossible to satisfy. He called an emergency council meeting that night, standing before the elders with an admission he never imagined himself making. "I need help finding her," he said, the words costing him more pride than he expected. "My own trackers have found nothing. I need to know if any of you have connections, allies, resources I haven't considered." Marta studied him for a long moment before responding, her expression unreadable. "Elena has always been more resourceful than you gave her credit for, Alpha King. She spent years building relationships you never noticed, learning skills you never asked about, preparing for possibilities you never imagined she was considering. If she does not want to be found, finding her will require more than trackers and search parties." "Then what do you suggest?" "I suggest," Marta said slowly, "that you consider why she left in the first place, and what it would actually take to convince her that returning would be safe. Elena did not run because she was weak, Damien. She ran because she was protecting her children from a father who had already shown, quite publicly, that he was willing to overlook them entirely in favor of someone else." The words landed with the weight of a blow, and Damien found himself unable to argue against them, because every part of what Marta said held uncomfortable truth. He had not been a husband worth staying for. He had not, in the months before the feast, been a man Elena could trust with the truth of what she carried. He had built, through his own actions and his own blindness, exactly the conditions that led her to disappear, rather than confide in him. "What would it take," he asked quietly, "for her to trust that returning was safe?" Nobody in the room had an easy answer for that, because the damage Damien had done could not be undone with a simple apology or a grand gesture. It would require him to become, in some fundamental way, a different man than the one who had stood up at that feast and humiliated his wife in front of everyone who mattered. Over the following weeks, as the wards continued their slow fade, and rogue incursions grew more frequent along the weakened borders, Damien found himself changing in ways he hadn't expected. He ended things with Celine formally, a difficult conversation that left both of them raw, but honest, for the first time in months, acknowledging that whatever they had shared had been built on circumstances that no longer served either of them well. He threw himself into learning the pack law he had always taken for granted, studying the old texts about succession and legitimate bloodline that Elena had apparently mastered quietly while he wasn't paying attention. He began questioning his own decisions, his own assumptions, in a way that felt uncomfortable and necessary in equal measure. It was Ruth, eventually, who gave him his first real lead, though not intentionally. The old healer had remained in Blackthorn territory after Elena's disappearance, quietly going about her work, careful never to reveal her involvement in the escape. But Damien, in his growing desperation, had begun paying closer attention to everyone in the manor, watching for any sign of connection to his missing wife. He noticed, one afternoon, that Ruth kept a small collection of dried herbs on her windowsill that he didn't recognize, plants that didn't grow naturally in Blackthorn territory's climate. When he asked her about them, casually, testing a theory he hadn't fully formed yet, her hesitation lasted only a fraction of a second, but it was enough. "Where do these grow, Ruth?" he asked again, more pointed this time. "Various places, Alpha King," she said carefully. "I've traveled a great deal over the years, treating patients across many territories. Have you traveled recently?" The question hung in the air between them, and Damien watched Ruth's composure hold steady, even as something flickered behind her eyes, the careful calculation of a woman deciding exactly how much truth she could afford to reveal without betraying a promise she had made. "Alpha King," she said finally, choosing her words with obvious care, "I think it would serve you better to consider not where I have traveled, but what kind of man you intend to become, before you go looking for the family you lost. Elena did not disappear because she couldn't be found, if someone truly wanted to look. She disappeared because she needed time and safety to decide whether coming back was worth the risk. If you truly want to bring her home, I would suggest you spend less energy on trackers and more energy on becoming someone worth returning to." It was not confirmation of anything specific, but it was enough to tell Damien that Ruth knew more than she was saying, and enough to give him something he hadn't fully possessed since the night of the feast: a sense that finding Elena was not simply a matter of resources and manpower, but a matter of proving, through changed action rather than empty words, that he deserved the chance to make things right. He began, that same night, writing a letter he had no way of delivering, addressed to a wife whose location he did not know, filled with an honesty he had never managed to offer her while she still shared his roof. He did not know if she would ever read it. He did not know if she would ever come back. But for the first time since the feast that had shattered everything, Damien Blackthorne understood exactly what he had lost, and exactly how much work it would take to become a man worthy of getting it back. 200 miles from Blackthorne territory, in a small stone cottage tucked into the hills of a neutral region called Ashford Vale, Elena Voss woke before dawn, to the sound of her daughter fussing softly in the next room, and for the first time in months, she felt something close to peace settle over her, before the worries of the day fully arrived. The cottage belonged to an old friend of her mother's, a retired PAC diplomat named Corinne who had spent decades navigating the complicated politics between territories, before retiring to this quiet valley, where no PAC held official claim, and outsiders were welcomed, as long as they respected the neutral ground's careful rules. Corinne had offered Elena shelter without hesitation, the moment she arrived at her door 6 weeks earlier, exhausted and carrying 2 infants, asking no questions beyond what was necessary to help. Family looks after family, Corinne had said simply, ushering Elena inside, before the first threat of dawn could reveal her presence to anyone watching the roads. Your mother helped me through worse than this, once. I owe her more than a warm bed and quiet borders. The twins, whom Elena had named Wren and Ash after the trees that surrounded their new home, were growing stronger every week, their small bodies filling out, their eyes tracking movement with increasing awareness. Elena spent her mornings caring for them, her afternoons studying, and her evenings training in the small clearing behind the cottage where Corinne had once taught her own children basic self-defense decades earlier. It was during these training sessions that Elena began to discover something about herself she had never fully explored during her years as Blackthorne's Luna. She was stronger than anyone, including herself, had ever given her credit for being. You carry yourself like someone who has spent years being told to make herself smaller, Corinne observed one afternoon, watching Elena work through a series of defensive movements with more precision than raw power. That ends now, if you intend to survive out here on your own. I'm not entirely on my own, Elena said, wiping sweat from her forehead as she caught her breath. I have you. You have me for now, Corinne agreed. But I'm an old woman, Elena, and this valley offers protection through neutrality, not through strength. If Damien's people ever do find this place, or if any ambitious pack decides 2 unclaimed heirs would make a valuable prize, you need to be able to protect yourself and those children without relying on anyone else. The words settled into Elena with the weight of truth, and from that day forward, her training intensified. Corinne, despite her age, retained decades of accumulated knowledge about combat, about pack law, about the political maneuvering that had shaped territories across the region for generations, and she poured all of it into Elena, with the patient thoroughness of a woman who understood exactly how dangerous the world could be for an unprotected mother and her children. Elena learned to fight with a ferocity she hadn't known she possessed, channeling years of suppressed frustration and quiet humiliation into movements that grew sharper and more confident with every session. She learned pack law in depth, studying old texts Corinne kept in a small but impressively thorough library, learning exactly what rights her children held as legitimate heirs, exactly what protections existed for a Luna who had been publicly wronged, exactly what leverage she actually possessed if she ever chose to use it. She also learned, through careful research and long conversations with Corinne, about her own family's history, details her parents had never fully shared with her while she was growing up. Your mother's bloodline traces back further than most people realize, Corinne told her one evening, the 2 of them sitting by the fire while the twins slept soundly in their shared cradle nearby. The Voss family held significant power generations ago, before political marriages and shifting alliances diluted the name's influence. You carry more legitimate authority in your blood than Damien Blackthorne ever bothered to learn about, Elena. He married you for the alliance your family's old reputation provided, but he never took the time to understand what that reputation was actually built on. This revelation shifted something in Elena's understanding of her own situation. She had spent 5 years believing herself to be, at best, a useful political asset to Damien's ambitions, valuable for the alliance her family name represented, but otherwise unremarkable in her own right. Learning that her bloodline carried genuine historical weight, that she possessed inherited standing, independent of her marriage to Damien, gave her a foundation of confidence she had never fully possessed during her years as Blackthorn's Luna. "What does that mean, practically?" Elena asked. "For me, for the twins? It means," Corinne said, "that if you ever choose to press a claim, whether for yourself or on behalf of Ren and Ash, you have more legitimate standing than most people in this situation would possess. You are not simply a wronged wife, hiding with her children, Elena. You are the last legitimate holder of one of the oldest bloodlines in this region, currently protecting the only true heirs to one of the most powerful packs in the territory. That is not a position of weakness. That is a position of considerable strength, if you learn to wield it properly." Elena spent the following weeks absorbing this new understanding of herself, letting it reshape not just her physical training, but her entire sense of what her future might look like. She was no longer simply running from humiliation. She was building towards something, though she could not yet articulate exactly what that something might become. News from Blackthorn territory reached them occasionally, filtered through Corinne's remaining network of contacts across the region. Careful whispers passed along trade routes and diplomatic channels that eventually found their way to the quiet valley where Elena had taken refuge. She learned about the failing wards, about the rogue incursions along the eastern border, about the growing unrest among pack members who had begun questioning their Alpha King's judgment. She felt a complicated mixture of emotions upon hearing this news: satisfaction at the confirmation that her instincts had been correct, alongside a genuine concern for the pack members who had done nothing wrong, but were now bearing the consequences of Damien's mistakes. She had grown up understanding her duty to protect pack members, and though she had left Blackthorn behind, some part of that instinct remained, whether she wanted it to or not. "You still care about them," Corinne observed one evening, watching Elena's expression as she absorbed the latest news. "The pack members, I mean." "Not just Damien. They didn't ask for any of this," Elena said quietly. "The elders who watched me be humiliated, the warriors defending a border that's failing because of choices they had no say in, the children growing up in a pack whose protection is crumbling. None of them deserve to suffer for what Damien did. And yet you don't intend to return, simply to save them from the consequences of his actions?" Elena considered the question seriously, turning it over in her mind, the way Corinne had taught her to examine every important decision, from multiple angles, before committing to a course of action. "I intend to return," Elena said finally, "when returning serves my children's best interests, and when I can do so on terms that protect them and honor what I've built here. Not simply because Damien's mistakes are creating a crisis he now expects someone else to solve for him." Corinne smiled at that, a rare expression of genuine approval crossing her weathered face. "That, Elena, is exactly the kind of thinking that will keep you and those children safe, no matter what happens next." As the weeks continued to pass, Elena settled into a rhythm of life in Ashford Vale that felt, for the first time in years, entirely her own. She was no longer performing the role of dutiful Luna, carefully managing appearances and political relationships for the benefit of a husband who barely noticed her efforts. She was simply Elena, mother to 2 growing children, student of a wise and patient teacher, and gradually, someone rediscovering a version of herself that had existed before her marriage had slowly worn it away. The twins grew stronger and more alert with each passing week, Ren developing an early curiosity that had her reaching for everything within grasp, Ash showing a calmer temperament that reminded Elena, in quiet unguarded moments, of the man she had once believed Damien to be, before ambition and entitlement had reshaped him into someone she barely recognized. She found herself, some evenings, thinking about what her children's futures might actually look like. Would they grow up in this quiet valley, protected, but disconnected from the legacy that was rightfully theirs? Would they eventually return to Blackthorn territory, claiming a birthright that came with both power and considerable danger? Or would some entirely different path present itself, one Elena couldn't yet fully imagine from her current vantage point? She did not have answers to these questions yet, but for the first time since fleeing the feast that had upended her entire life, she felt equipped to eventually find them. She was stronger now, more knowledgeable, more confident in her own worth, independent of any title or marriage. Whatever came next, Whatever choices she eventually needed to make regarding Damien, regarding the pack, regarding her children's futures, she would face those choices as a woman who had rebuilt herself from the ground up, rather than the quiet, dutiful wife who had been publicly discarded at that terrible feast. It was during the 10th week of their stay in Ashford Vale that the first sign of real danger arrived, a warning that would force Elena to confront exactly how prepared she truly was for the threats that existed beyond the valley's careful neutrality. A stranger appeared at the edge of the valley's border one evening, a scout by the careful, measured way he moved through the forest, clearly skilled in tracking despite his attempts to remain unseen. Corinne's network of watchers spotted him almost immediately, word reaching the cottage before the sun had fully set. "He's not one of Damien's," Corinne said grimly, studying the description her contacts had provided. "The markings on his cloak, the way he carries himself. That's a Ravenswood scout, Elena. And if Ravenswood has learned there are unclaimed heirs hiding in this valley, we have a very different kind of problem than the one we've been preparing for." Elena felt her blood run cold at the name. Ravenswood was a rival pack known throughout the region for aggressive expansion, and a willingness to use whatever means necessary to strengthen their claim to power, including, according to old rumors Elena had heard during her years as Blackthorn's Luna, the forced adoption of unclaimed heirs from weakened neighboring packs. Whatever peace and safety Elena had found in this quiet valley, she understood in that moment, was about to be tested in ways far more dangerous than anything she had faced since the night she'd fled the feast, with her children hidden against her chest. The Ravenswood scout did not approach the cottage that first night, content instead to watch from a distance, gathering whatever information he could before reporting back to whoever had sent him. Corinne's watchers tracked his movements carefully, careful never to reveal themselves, understanding that direct confrontation with a scout might only confirm suspicions that were still, hopefully, unproven. "He's testing the waters," Corinne explained to Elena the following morning, both of them speaking in low voices while the twins napped nearby. "Ravenswood has likely heard rumors, nothing more concrete than whispers passed along trade routes. They send scouts to confirm or deny before committing real resources to an investigation. What happens if he confirms what he's looking for?" Corinne's expression grew serious, in a way that made Elena's stomach tighten with dread. "Then Ravenswood sends more than a single scout. They send a retrieval party, Elena. And if they believe two unclaimed alpha heirs are sitting undefended in a neutral valley, they will not hesitate to take what they consider a valuable opportunity." Elena spent that day in a state of controlled tension, going through her normal routines with the twins, while her mind worked through every possible response to the threat now looming at the edge of their carefully constructed safety. She thought about Damien, about the pack she had left behind, about whether the danger now approaching her children might eventually force her hand in ways she hadn't anticipated when she'd first fled Blackthorn territory. "I need to know more about Ravenswood," Elena said that evening, once the twins were settled for the night. "Their pack structure, their alpha, what exactly they might want from children they consider unclaimed." Corinne pulled out an old map, one marked with careful annotations from decades of diplomatic work across the region, and began walking Elena through the political landscape she had spent years navigating personally. "Ravenswood's current alpha is a man named Gideon Cross," Corinne explained. "Ambitious, calculating, and unlike most alphas I've dealt with over the years, genuinely intelligent about long-term strategy, rather than simple brute strength. He's spent the last decade expanding Ravenswood's territory through a combination of careful alliances and, when necessary, less scrupulous methods." "What kind of less scrupulous methods?" "Adoption of unclaimed heirs from weakened bloodlines is one strategy he's used before," Corinne said grimly. "Not kidnapping in the traditional sense, though it often amounts to the same thing in practice. He finds children with legitimate claims to power in packs experiencing instability, offers their guardians protection and resources in exchange for eventual loyalty, and gradually absorbs both the children and whatever legitimate claims they carry into Ravenswood's growing sphere of influence." Elena felt sick at the description, understanding immediately the danger her children now faced. Ren and Ash, as unclaimed heirs to one of the region's most significant bloodlines, represented exactly the kind of opportunity Gideon Cross had exploited before, and if Ravenswood's scout confirmed their presence in this valley, Elena had no doubt the pack would move quickly to claim what they perceived as a valuable strategic asset. "I won't let that happen," Elena said, her voice steady, despite the fear churning beneath the surface. "I know you won't," Corinne said, "which means we need to prepare, carefully and immediately, for whatever comes next." Over the following days, Elena and Corinne worked to reinforce every possible layer of protection around the cottage and the surrounding property. Corinne called in favors from her remaining network of contacts, arranging for additional watchers to monitor the valley's borders more closely, while Elena intensified her own training, pushing herself harder than she ever had before, driven by the understanding that her children's safety might soon depend entirely on her own capabilities. She also began seriously considering, for the first time since fleeing Blackthorn territory, whether reaching out to allies beyond Corinne's network might eventually become necessary. She thought of her mother's old diplomatic contacts, relationships Elena had cultivated quietly during her years as Luna, careful friendships built with wolves from various territories, who owed her favors from small kindnesses, and diplomatic assistance she had provided over the years, without any expectation of return. "There's someone I could contact," Elena said one evening, after the twins had finally settled into sleep. "A woman named Ivy, Luna of the Thornfield Pack. We've known each other since we were young, before either of us married into our current positions. She's always been fair, always been someone I trusted, even during the years when trust felt like a luxury I couldn't afford within my own marriage." "Would she help, if you asked?" "I believe so," Elena said. "Thornfield has always maintained careful neutrality regarding conflicts between other packs, but Ivy has never been someone who ignored genuine danger to innocent children, regardless of political complications." Corinne considered this for a long moment, before nodding slowly. "It might be worth reaching out, carefully, not as a plea for rescue, but as a request for information and potential alliance. If Thornfield has any awareness of Ravenswood's current movements or intentions, that knowledge could prove invaluable." Elena sent a carefully worded letter to Ivy the following morning, delivered through one of Corinne's most trusted contacts, explaining enough of her current situation to convey the urgency, without revealing details that might endanger her children further if the letter fell into the wrong hands. She spent the following days in a state of anxious waiting, continuing her training and her careful monitoring of the valley's borders, while hoping for a response that might provide some additional layer of security against the threat now looming over her carefully rebuilt life. The response, when it finally arrived 8 days later, brought both relief and new complications in equal measure. Ivy's letter confirmed what Corinne had suspected. Ravenswood had indeed been actively searching for information about unclaimed heirs from weakened bloodlines across the region, their interest heightened significantly by recent rumors about instability within Blackthorn territory following Elena's disappearance. Ivy offered Thornfield's protection and resources should Elena choose to relocate somewhere with more substantial military backing than Ashford Vale's careful neutrality could provide. But the letter also contained a warning that made Elena's blood run cold. Damien, according to Ivy's information, had also intensified his own search efforts in recent weeks, expanding beyond simple trackers to include diplomatic inquiries across multiple territories, careful questions asked through official channels about any sightings of a woman traveling with twin infants. Word of his search had reached far enough that even Ravenswood's leadership had apparently taken notice, adding another layer of urgency to their own investigation into rumors about unclaimed heirs. Elena was, in effect, being hunted from two directions simultaneously, her husband seeking to reclaim what he had once carelessly discarded, and a rival pack seeking to claim her children as a strategic asset, regardless of the danger or disruption such an action would cause to their carefully rebuilt lives. "We need to make a decision," Corinne said, once Elena had finished reading the letter aloud. "Staying here is becoming increasingly dangerous, now that both Damien and Ravenswood appear to be closing in from different directions. We could relocate to Thornfield territory, accepting Ivy's offer of protection, though that comes with its own complications regarding your children's eventual claims and obligations. Or, we could consider a different path entirely." "What different path?" Corinne met Elena's eyes with an expression of careful seriousness. "You could choose to stop running, Elena. You could choose to confront the situation directly, on your own terms, using everything you've learned and everything you've become during these months in hiding. You are no longer the woman who fled that feast in quiet humiliation. You are someone with legitimate claims, genuine strength, and powerful allies now aware of your situation. Perhaps it's time to consider whether hiding continues to serve your children's best interests, or whether standing and fighting for what's rightfully theirs might actually offer them a safer, more secure future. Elena sat with that question for a long time that evening, watching her children sleep peacefully, unaware of the danger gathering around them from multiple directions. She thought about the woman she had been the night of the feast, quietly humiliated and desperately protecting her secret, and the woman she had become in the months since, stronger, more knowledgeable, more confident in her own worth and capabilities. She thought about Damien, about whether the reports of his changed behavior, his ended relationship with Celine, his genuine efforts to understand pack law and improve his leadership, represented real transformation, or simply desperate political maneuvering in response to the crisis his own choices had created. And she thought about her children's futures, about whether continuing to hide in increasingly precarious safety truly served them better than claiming, openly and on her own terms, the legitimate power and protection that came with their birthright. "I need more information before I decide anything," Elena said finally. About Damien's current state of mind, about how seriously he intends to change, about whether returning to Blackthorn territory would actually provide the security my children need, or simply trade one set of dangers for another. "How do you propose to get that information?" Elena's expression hardened with a determination that reminded Corinne, not for the first time, exactly how much her young protégé had grown during their months together. "I think it's time I found out for myself," Elena said, carefully, and on my own terms, without revealing my location or endangering my children in the process. "But I need to understand what I'm actually deciding between before I commit my family's future to any particular path." The decision marked a turning point in Elena's time in Ashford Vale, shifting her focus from purely defensive preparation toward active investigation and strategic planning. Whatever came next, whether that meant continued hiding, relocation to Thornfield's protection, or eventual confrontation with both Damien and Ravenswood, Elena understood that she needed clearer information before committing to any particular course of action. She began, with Corinne's careful guidance, to develop a network of her own. Cautious inquiries, sent through trusted intermediaries, careful questions asked of contacts who owed her favors from her years as Blackthorn's Luna, all designed to build a clearer picture of the current political landscape without revealing her own location or exposing her children to unnecessary risk. What she would eventually learn, through this careful investigation, would ultimately force her hand in ways she hadn't fully anticipated, setting in motion the confrontation that had been building since the night she first fled that terrible feast, carrying her children into an uncertain future she was now, finally, prepared to face on her own terms. The information Elena gathered over the following 2 weeks painted a picture of Blackthorn territory, far more complicated than she had expected when she first began her careful investigation. Through a trusted intermediary, an older trader named Foster, who had carried messages between territories for decades, and whose discretion Corinne vouched for completely, Elena learned that Damien had indeed ended his relationship with Celine formally, a fact confirmed independently by 2 separate sources within Blackthorn territory. Celine herself had reportedly left the pack shortly after, returning to her own family's territory, though whether that departure was voluntary or requested remained unclear from the fragments of information Elena managed to piece together. More surprising was the news about Damien's changed behavior within the council chambers. According to Foster's contacts, the Alpha King had spent the recent weeks immersed in old texts about pack law and succession, working closely with the elders to understand exactly what mistakes had led to the current crisis with the failing wards. He had reportedly ended several long-standing habits the elders had privately criticized for years, including his tendency to make major decisions without consulting the full council, and had begun, for the first time in his 8 years as Alpha King, actually listening to advice, rather than simply expecting deference. Elena read these reports with careful skepticism, unwilling to trust second-hand accounts of transformation from a man who had shown her, quite thoroughly, exactly how little her feelings had mattered to him during the years of their marriage. People did not simply change overnight because circumstances forced their hand, she reasoned. Real change required sustained effort over time, tested by genuine difficulty rather than simply performed for an audience hoping to see improvement. but she also could not ignore the deeper crisis unfolding within the pack she had once called home. The border wards continued their slow deterioration, now affecting nearly a third of Blackthorn's territorial boundary, according to Foster's most recent report, and rogue incursions had grown frequent enough that Damien had been forced to establish permanent guard posts along the weakened sections, stretching his warriors thin and creating exactly the kind of vulnerability that ambitious rival packs like Ravenswood would eventually exploit if the situation continued unresolved. Pack members were suffering for a crisis they had not created, and Elena felt the weight of that reality, pressing against her careful calculations, complicating what had initially felt like a straightforward decision to prioritize her own children's safety above all other considerations. It was during this period of careful deliberation that the Ravenswood threat finally escalated beyond simple scouting. Corinne's watchers spotted a larger group approaching the valley's borders late one evening, 5 wolves moving with the coordinated precision of trained warriors, rather than the careful, solitary movement of a single scout gathering information. The group made no immediate move toward the cottage, instead establishing what appeared to be a temporary camp just beyond the valley's neutral boundary, watching and waiting in a way that suggested they were building towards something more substantial than simple observation. "This is what we feared," Corinne said grimly, watching the reports come in from her network of watchers. "Ravenswood believes they've confirmed enough information to justify direct action. That camp isn't just observation, Elena. They're preparing for a retrieval attempt." Elena felt fear coil tight in her chest, but beneath the fear, something steadier had taken root during her months of training and preparation, a calm determination that hadn't existed in her the night she'd fled Blackthorn Manor, with her children hidden against her body. "How long do we have?" "Difficult to say precisely," Corinne said. "Perhaps a few days, if they're waiting for additional reinforcements before making a move. Perhaps only hours, if they've decided the current numbers are sufficient. We should assume the shorter timeline and prepare accordingly." That night, Elena made the decision that would ultimately determine the direction of everything that followed. She could not risk her children's safety on the uncertain protection of Ashford Vale's neutral status, not against a pack as determined and well-resourced as Ravenswood appeared to be. She needed a stronger alliance, immediate and substantial, and there was only one option that offered both the strength required and the legitimate claim that would prevent Ravenswood from simply trying again later with a different strategy. She needed to contact Damien directly, on her own terms, with her own conditions clearly established before any reunion took place. "Are you certain about this?" Corinne asked, watching Elena draft the careful letter that would set everything in motion. "No," Elena admitted honestly, "but I'm certain that Ravenswood represents an immediate threat my children cannot survive without stronger protection than we currently possess." Whatever Damien has or hasn't genuinely changed about himself, Blackthorn's military strength remains formidable enough to deter Ravenswood from any retrieval attempt, provided I can secure that protection without surrendering the leverage I've spent these months building. The letter Elena sent that night was carefully worded, revealing her general location, without providing precise details that could be exploited if intercepted, explaining enough about the Ravenswood threat to convey genuine urgency, and establishing clear conditions under which she would consider any reunion. She demanded transparency about pack decisions moving forward, formal acknowledgement of her children's legitimate claim to succession, and most importantly, a guarantee of her own continued authority and respect within any arrangement they might eventually reach. She sent the letter through Foster, trusting his discretion completely, and then spent the following 2 days in a state of controlled tension, continuing her defensive preparations while watching for any response, all while Ravenswood's camp remained visible at the edge of the valley, patient and waiting. Damien's response arrived faster than Elena expected, delivered personally by Foster, along with a report that made her blood run cold. The traitor had spotted Damien himself, along with a substantial force of Blackthorn warriors, already moving in the general direction of Ashford Vale, before Elena's letter had even reached him, apparently following a lead his own investigators had developed independently. The letter itself, when Elena finally read it alone in the quiet of her bedroom, contained none of the arrogant confidence she remembered from her husband's usual correspondence. Instead, it read like the words of a man who had spent months confronting exactly how badly he had failed the people who depended on him. He acknowledged, in careful detail, every mistake he had made, From his public humiliation of her at the feast, to his complete failure to notice her pregnancy, to his blindness regarding the genuine political and emotional needs of the woman he had married for alliance, but never truly tried to understand. He did not ask for forgiveness, exactly, understanding perhaps that forgiveness could not simply be requested and granted like a formal agreement. Instead, he asked for the opportunity to prove, through sustained action, rather than empty words, that he had genuinely changed enough to deserve a chance at rebuilding what he had so carelessly destroyed. He also confirmed, with an urgency that matched Elena's own concerns, that he was aware of Ravenswood's movements in the region, and was bringing sufficient force to ensure her and the children's safety, regardless of whatever decision she ultimately made about their future together. Elena read the letter twice, searching for the manipulation and calculation she expected to find beneath the careful words, and found instead something that troubled her more than outright deception would have. Genuine, uncomfortable honesty about failures too significant to easily forgive. The confrontation, when it finally came, arrived with a suddenness that left little time for careful deliberation. Ravenswood's forces moved against the valley just before dawn the following morning, apparently deciding that Damien's approaching warriors represented a threat to their retrieval plans, significant enough to force immediate action, rather than continued patient waiting. Elena woke to the sound of Corinne's urgent warning, shouting through the cottage that the attack had begun, that Ravenswood warriors were pushing through the valley's weak neutral boundaries with clear intent to reach the cottage before any rescue could arrive. What followed was chaos and fear unlike anything Elena had experienced since fleeing Blackthorn Manor months earlier, but this time, she was not the frightened woman running with her children hidden against her chest. She was someone who had spent months training for exactly this moment, and as Ravenswood warriors pushed toward the cottage where her children slept, Elena Voss transformed, in the space of a few desperate minutes, into a fierce and formidable defender, fighting with everything she possessed to protect what mattered most in the world to her. She fought alongside Corinne and the handful of trained watchers the older woman had gathered over the preceding days, holding the line at the cottage's entrance, while Ravenswood warriors pressed forward with the confident aggression of a pack accustomed to easy victories against weaker opponents. But Elena was no longer weak, no longer the woman Damien had underestimated for 5 years of quiet marriage, and the ferocity with which she defended her children surprised even the seasoned Ravenswood warriors who had expected a straightforward retrieval, rather than genuine resistance. The battle hung in a precarious balance, Elena and her small group of defenders holding their ground, but slowly losing strength against Ravenswood's superior numbers, when the sound of additional warriors crashing through the tree line announced the arrival of reinforcements that would ultimately determine the outcome of the entire confrontation. Damien arrived at the head of a substantial force of Blackthorn warriors, moving with the speed of a man who understood exactly what was at stake, and the sight of him fighting alongside Elena for the first time since their separation, driving back Ravenswood's forces with genuine skill and determination, created a strange and complicated moment amid the chaos of battle. Elena had time only to register his presence, fighting fiercely at her side, rather than simply watching from a position of safety, before the true scope of the danger they faced became clear. This was not simply a battle over territory or political advantage. This was a fight for the survival of her children, for the future of the bloodline she had protected through months of careful hiding, and as Ravenswood's forces finally began to retreat, under the combined pressure of Blackthorn's reinforcements and Elena's own ferocious defense, something shifted in the dynamic between Elena and the husband who had once so carelessly humiliated her. He had come not as a king demanding the return of his property, but as a man fighting genuinely and desperately to protect the family he had nearly lost through his own failures. And as the battle finally ended, Ravenswood's remaining warriors retreating into the forest rather than risk further losses against Blackthorn's superior numbers, Elena found herself standing amid the wreckage of the fight, breathing hard, her children safe inside the cottage behind her, facing a husband who looked at her with an expression she had never seen from him before. Genuine relief, genuine fear for what he might have lost, and genuine respect for the woman she had become during their months apart. In the aftermath of the battle, as Blackthorn warriors secured the perimeter of Ashford Vale and tended to the wounded among their ranks, Elena and Damien stood facing each other for the first time in months, the weight of everything unspoken between them pressing down on the quiet morning air. "You're really here," Elena said finally, her voice steady, despite the exhaustion pulling at her limbs. I am, Damien said. I should have been here months ago. I should have known, should have looked closer, should have been the husband and father I failed completely to be. I can't undo any of that, Elena. I can only try to prove, going forward, that I understand exactly what I lost. Elena studied him carefully, searching his expression for the calculation and entitlement she had grown so accustomed to during their years of marriage, and found instead something that looked, cautiously, like genuine humility. The children are inside, she said. You should meet them properly, if you intend to be part of their lives going forward. Damien's expression shifted at those words, something raw and emotional crossing his features, that Elena had never witnessed from him before, not once during 5 years of marriage. He followed her into the cottage, moving carefully, almost reverently, as she led him to where Ren and Ash slept peacefully, undisturbed by the chaos that had unfolded just outside their walls. He stood over the cradle for a long moment, staring down at the twin infants who represented everything he had carelessly discarded the night of that terrible feast, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a rawness Elena had never heard from him before. They're perfect, he said quietly. I don't deserve to be their father, after everything I did, but I want the chance to try to earn that place, if you'll allow it. Elena watched him carefully, weighing his words against the months of careful growth she had undergone herself, against the strength and confidence she had built independent of any relationship with him, against the very real danger that had just threatened her children's safety and the uncertain future that still lay ahead, regardless of whatever decision she made about Damien's place in their lives. This isn't a simple decision, she said finally. You hurt me in ways that will take considerable time to heal, if they ever fully heal at all. I am not the same woman who left that feast, Damien. I've built a life, a strength, an understanding of my own worth that exists entirely independent of you and independent of Blackthorn's throne. Whatever happens next between us, it happens on my terms, with my conditions respected completely, or it doesn't happen at all. I understand, Damien said. I'm not asking you to simply forgive everything and return to how things were before. I know that version of our marriage failed both of us completely. I'm asking for the opportunity to build something different, something better, with the woman you've become, rather than the one I took for granted. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of Marta approaching, along with several other pack elders who had accompanied Damien's forces, and Elena found herself facing, for the first time since fleeing the feast, direct confirmation of exactly how significantly the political landscape had shifted during her months away. Luna Voss, Marta said, using Elena's formal title with careful deliberateness. The council owes you a considerable apology for how the events of that feast were allowed to unfold. We should have intervened. We should have protected you from the humiliation you experienced, rather than remaining silent while our Alpha King made decisions that nearly destroyed this entire pack's future. Elena studied the elder carefully, recognizing in her words an admission that extended beyond simple courtesy, a genuine acknowledgement of institutional failure that had allowed Damien's mistakes to unfold without proper check or challenge from the very council meant to provide balance against any Alpha's worst impulses. What happens now, Elena asked, if I choose to return to Blackthorn territory? Marta exchanged a glance with the other elders before responding, and Elena understood, watching that careful exchange, that this conversation had been planned and discussed extensively before Damien's forces had even departed to find her. That depends entirely on your own wishes, Luna Voss, Marta said. The council has discussed the matter extensively during your absence, and we are united in our position that whatever arrangement moves forward must respect your full authority and your children's legitimate claim to succession, regardless of whatever personal decisions you make regarding your marriage to Damien. You are not required to simply return to your previous role as though nothing occurred. If you choose to return, you return with whatever conditions and protections you require to feel genuinely secure and respected within this pack. The offer was more substantial than Elena had anticipated, and she found herself reconsidering, in light of this genuine institutional support, exactly what her own priorities and requirements should be as she navigated the complicated decision of whether and how to return to the life she had fled months earlier. Over the following days, as Blackthorn warriors secured Ashford Vale against any further Ravenswood incursion, and word spread throughout the region about the successful defense of Elena and her children, Extensive negotiations unfolded between Elena, Damien, and the assembled pack elders regarding exactly what conditions would need to be met for Elena to consider bringing her children back to Blackthorn territory. Elena insisted on formal, binding acknowledgement of Ren and Ash's legitimate claim to succession, documented and witnessed in ways that could never again be dismissed or overlooked, as they had been the night of the feast. She insisted on her own restored full authority as Luna, with genuine decision-making power within council matters rather than simple ceremonial presence. She insisted on formal accountability measures that would prevent any future Alpha King, whether Damien or his eventual successor, from making unilateral decisions about succession without proper consultation and transparency with both the council and the pack at large. Damien agreed to every condition without argument, understanding clearly that his previous failures had earned him no standing to negotiate or push back against reasonable demands for accountability and change. "There's something else," Elena said, during one of their final conversations before the formal arrangements were finalized. "Celine's child. What happens there?" Damien's expression grew troubled at the question, and Elena watched him work through a response that clearly required careful consideration. "The child isn't mine," he said finally. "I had it confirmed through proper testing once Celine left the territory. She knew, I believe, before she ever sat at that table during the feast. Whatever she hoped to gain by claiming the child was mine, it wasn't genuine confusion about paternity." The revelation added a layer of betrayal Elena hadn't fully anticipated, understanding now that the humiliation she'd experienced at the feast had been built not just on Damien's carelessness and infidelity, but on an outright deception that Celine had apparently constructed with calculated precision, likely hoping to secure her own position and resources through a false claim that Damien, in his eagerness for an heir, had been too blinded by desire to properly verify. "Does the pack know?" "The council knows," Damien confirmed. "It will be made public knowledge, alongside formal acknowledgement of Ren and Ash's legitimate status, ensuring there's no ambiguity remaining about the true succession moving forward." The final agreement, when it was eventually formalized weeks later back in Blackthorn territory, represented a fundamentally different arrangement than the marriage Elena had fled months earlier. She returned not as a quiet, dutiful Luna expected to simply accept whatever her Alpha King decided, but as a full and equal partner in pack leadership, with formal protections ensuring her voice and her children's legitimate claims could never again be overlooked or dismissed the way they had been that terrible night at the feast. The border wards, once Ren and Ash's presence was formally re-established within Blackthorn territory, and the truth of their legitimate bloodline was properly acknowledged through the old rituals the elders performed, began slowly healing, the ancient magic responding to the restoration of true succession in ways that confirmed, beyond any remaining doubt, exactly what had been at stake during Elena's months in hiding. Standing in the Great Hall months later, in the same space where she had once been publicly humiliated in front of hundreds of witnesses, Elena watched as the pack elders formally acknowledged Ren and Ash as legitimate heirs to the Blackthorn throne, their small forms held carefully by their parents, while the assembled pack members offered genuine, unforced respect, rather than the careful courtesy that had marked her previous years as Luna. She was no longer the woman who had been quietly discarded in favor of a calculated deception. She was the woman who had protected her children through months of danger and uncertainty, who had rebuilt herself from the ground up into someone stronger and more confident than she had ever imagined possible, and who had ultimately returned not out of desperation or lack of options, but because she had genuinely believed, after careful consideration and hard-won conditions, that this pack and this partnership with Damien offered her children the safest and most secure future available to them. Damien stood beside her, holding Ash carefully against his chest, and when he looked at Elena across the space that had once been the site of her greatest humiliation, the expression on his face carried none of the arrogant entitlement she remembered from their earlier years together. Instead, it held something that looked genuinely like respect, genuinely like understanding, of exactly how much strength and resilience the woman beside him had discovered within herself during the months he had spent failing to properly value her. "Thank you," he said quietly, meant only for her ears, amid the celebration unfolding around them, "for giving me the chance to become someone worthy of this family, even though I never deserved it in the first place." Elena looked at her husband, at her children, at the pack that had once watched her be humiliated, and now watched her stand as their equal and rightful Luna, and felt, for the first time since that terrible feast had shattered her old life completely, a genuine sense of peace about the future stretching out ahead of them. The path forward would not be simple, she understood. Trust, once broken as thoroughly as Damien had broken it, could not be fully restored overnight, and the work of rebuilding genuine partnership between them would require sustained effort and patience from both of them for years to come. But she faced that future now as someone who had proven, beyond any doubt, exactly what she was capable of when everything she loved was threatened, and that knowledge, more than any formal title or acknowledgement from the Pack Council, gave her the genuine confidence to believe that whatever challenges lay ahead, she and her children would face them from a position of strength rather than vulnerability. The Pack's future, once nearly lost through careless humiliation and calculated deception, had ultimately been saved not by the Alpha King, who had almost destroyed it, but by the Luna he had underestimated, who had vanished into the night with everything that truly mattered, and returned, months later, as someone far too strong to ever be discarded again. Peace, Elena quickly discovered, did not arrive simply because a formal ceremony had taken place in the Great Hall. It had to be built, slowly and deliberately, in the quiet, ordinary moments that made up the days following her return to Blackthorn territory, and the process proved far more complicated than she had anticipated during her months of careful preparation in Ashford Vale. The Pack itself welcomed her back with genuine warmth, the elders following through on every promise they had made regarding her restored authority, and the warriors who had fought alongside her during the Ravenswood confrontation treated her with a respect that felt earned rather than simply owed to her title. But rebuilding an actual working partnership with Damien proved a slower and more difficult undertaking than either of them had fully anticipated when they'd negotiated the terms of her return. "You still watch me like you're waiting for me to disappoint you again," Damien observed one evening, several weeks after Elena's formal return, the two of them sitting together in the study that had once belonged exclusively to him, but now served as a shared space for council preparation and pack business. "I am waiting," Elena admitted honestly, "not because I doubt your intentions right now, but because intentions and sustained action are different things. Damien, you told me you'd changed before, in small ways, throughout our marriage, and those changes never lasted longer than the immediate crisis that prompted them." The observation stung. She could see it in the way his jaw tightened, but he did not argue against it, understanding by now that defensive denial would only confirm the pattern she was describing, rather than disprove it. "What would convince you?" he asked instead, "not empty words. What actual sustained action would help you trust that this time is genuinely different?" Elena considered the question seriously, understanding that her answer mattered a great deal for the future they were attempting to build together. "Time," she said finally. "Consistency over months, not weeks. Watching you actually consult the council on major decisions. Watching you continue treating Ren and Ash as legitimate heirs, even when it's politically inconvenient. Watching you extend the same respect to me in private that you've shown publicly since my return. Trust isn't something you can rebuild through a single grand gesture, Damien. It has to be earned through hundreds of small, consistent choices over time." Damien absorbed this with visible effort, and over the following months, Elena watched him make exactly the kind of sustained effort she had described, imperfectly at times, but genuinely and persistently. He brought major decisions to the full council, rather than making unilateral choices, even when doing so slowed processes he might once have simply forced through on his own authority. He spent time with Ren and Ash daily, learning their individual personalities and needs, with the kind of attentive care Elena had never witnessed from him during their earlier years together. He treated Elena as a genuine partner in leadership rather than simply a ceremonial figure, seeking her counsel on matters ranging from pack diplomacy to internal disputes. And gradually, month by month, the careful wariness Elena had carried since her return began to soften, replaced by something that felt, cautiously, like genuine trust rebuilding itself from a foundation of consistent proof, rather than empty promises. The lingering threat from Ravenswood, however, remained a persistent concern throughout this period of careful rebuilding. Though their initial retrieval attempt had failed, Gideon Cross showed no sign of abandoning his interest in Blackthorn's newly confirmed heirs, and reports continued reaching the Pack Council about Ravenswood scouts probing various sections of the territory's borders, testing for weaknesses that might present future opportunities. He won't simply give up, Marta warned during one council session, several months after Elena's return. Gideon Cross has built his reputation on patient, calculated opportunism. If he cannot claim your children through force, he may attempt other strategies, political maneuvering, alliance building with other territories interested in weakening Blackthorn's position, perhaps even direct diplomatic pressure, disguised as legitimate concern about succession matters. Elena and Damien took this warning seriously, working together with the council to develop a comprehensive strategy for strengthening Blackthorn's political position across the region, rebuilding damaged alliances, and ensuring that any future move against them would face consequences severe enough to discourage even someone as calculating as Gideon Cross from pursuing further action. This shared work, tackling genuine external threats together as true partners, rather than simply husband and wife performing a political marriage, became, unexpectedly, one of the most significant factors in rebuilding the trust between them. Elena found herself relying on Damien's genuine strategic intelligence in ways she hadn't previously experienced, and Damien, in turn, discovered exactly how skilled and insightful his wife had become during her months of independent study and preparation, her contributions to pack strategy proving invaluable, in ways that finally forced him to fully recognize the partner he had so carelessly undervalued for years. It was during this period that Elena also began the difficult work of processing her own emotions about everything that had happened, seeking guidance not just from Corinne, who remained a trusted advisor even after Elena's return to Blackthorn territory, but also from Ruth, whose steady wisdom had guided her through the most difficult moments of her escape and pregnancy. "You don't have to forgive him completely," Ruth told her, during one quiet conversation, months into Elena's return, "simply because circumstances have brought you back together. Forgiveness, if it comes, should come at its own pace, built on genuine understanding, rather than obligation." "I know," Elena said, "but I find myself, more often than I expected, actually believing in the changes he's made. Not perfectly, not without lingering doubt, but genuinely, in ways that surprise me, given everything that happened." "That's not weakness, Elena," Ruth said gently. "That's wisdom. Recognizing genuine change when you see it, while still maintaining the boundaries and self-respect you've earned through everything you survived, is not a contradiction. It's exactly the kind of balanced strength that will serve you well, as Luna moving forward." As the months passed, and the border wards continued their slow healing, restored by the confirmed presence of legitimate heirs within Blackthorn territory, Elena found herself settling into a version of her old role that felt, in many important ways, entirely new. She was Luna again, but not the quiet, dutiful figure she had once been. She was a genuine leader in her own right, respected by the council, trusted by the pack, and increasingly, cautiously, rebuilding something real with the husband who had once so thoroughly failed her. The twins grew rapidly during this period, Ren developing into a curious, energetic toddler who seemed constantly determined to explore every corner of the manor, while Ash showed early signs of the thoughtful, careful temperament that reminded Elena, in the best possible ways now, of the man Damien was gradually becoming, rather than the careless husband who had once humiliated her at that terrible feast. Celine, meanwhile, remained a distant but persistent concern. Reports occasionally reached Blackthorn territory about her activities in her family's home territory, rumors suggesting she had not fully abandoned her ambitions regarding Blackthorn's throne, despite the exposure of her deception about the child's true paternity. Elena and Damien discussed these reports carefully whenever they arose, understanding that Celine's calculated nature made her a continued, if currently distant, threat that could not be entirely dismissed. "She won't simply disappear quietly," Damien said during one such discussion, nearly a year after Elena's return to Blackthorn territory. "Someone with her ambition rarely accepts defeat without attempting some final maneuver. Then we watch carefully," Elena said, "and we prepare accordingly. But I won't let the possibility of her continued scheming dictate how we live our lives now. We've built something genuine here, Damien. Something worth protecting, but also something worth actually living, rather than simply defending against every possible future threat." It was a philosophy that guided them through the following months. Careful vigilance balanced against genuine investment in building a life and a partnership that felt increasingly authentic rather than simply politically necessary. Elena watched herself, with quiet satisfaction, becoming genuinely happy in ways she had never expected to feel again, after the humiliation of that terrible feast, watching her children thrive in a pack that had learned, through painful experience, exactly how much their legitimate presence and protection actually mattered to the ancient magic that bound Blackthorn's future security to the truth of proper succession. The path forward, she understood, would never be entirely free of complication or lingering threat. But for the first time since fleeing into the night with her children hidden against her chest, Elena Voss felt genuinely secure in the life she had rebuilt, confident in her own strength and worth, and cautiously, carefully hopeful about the future stretching out ahead of her family and the pack she had once believed she might never call home again. The final maneuver Damien had predicted arrived nearly 18 months after Elena's return to Blackthorn territory, and it came from a direction none of them had fully anticipated. Celine arrived at the border of Blackthorn territory unannounced on a cold autumn morning, traveling alone and without escort, requesting formal audience with the council, rather than attempting any of the covert scheming Elena and Damien had spent months preparing against. The request itself was unusual enough that Marta brought the news directly to Elena and Damien, rather than handling it through normal channels. She claims to have information relevant to the pack's security, Marta reported. Information regarding Ravenswood, specifically. Elena and Damien exchanged a careful glance, both of them wary of a trap but understanding that dismissing genuine intelligence about a persistent threat like Ravenswood carried its own risks. They agreed to grant Celine a formal audience, though Damien insisted on additional security precautions given her history of calculated deception. Celine arrived in the council chamber looking notably different than the confident, glowing woman who had once sat beside Damien at that fateful feast. She appeared tired, worn by whatever circumstances had shaped the 18 months since she'd left Blackthorn territory, and when she spoke, her voice carried none of the practiced confidence Elena remembered from their earlier encounter. "I know what I did was unforgivable," Celine began, addressing the assembled council, rather than Damien or Elena directly. "I don't expect forgiveness, and I'm not here seeking it. I'm here because I've learned something that puts this entire pack at risk, and despite everything, I won't stand by and let innocent people suffer for choices Gideon Cross is planning to make." Over the following hour, Celine laid out a detailed account of Ravenswood's evolving strategy, information she had apparently gathered through her family's territory, which maintained trade relationships with several Ravenswood-aligned settlements. According to her account, Gideon Cross had abandoned direct retrieval attempts against Blackthorn's heirs, recognizing after the failed Ashford Vale confrontation that such tactics would only strengthen resistance and alliance building against him. Instead, he had shifted toward a longer-term strategy of political isolation, working to undermine Blackthorn's alliances with neighboring territories through careful manipulation and false information designed to paint Damien as an unstable leader, whose recent crisis with the failing wards indicated deeper weakness within the pack's governance. "Why tell us this?" Damien asked, his skepticism evident despite the apparent sincerity of Celine's account. "What do you gain from warning us?" Celine's expression grew complicated, something between genuine remorse and careful calculation that Elena recognized, understanding that even now, this woman's motivations likely remained more complex than simple altruism. "I gain nothing directly," Celine said, "but I've spent the last 18 months watching my own family's territory suffer under the same kind of political manipulation Gideon Cross is now directing at Blackthorn. He nearly succeeded in isolating us from our traditional allies before we recognized the pattern and pushed back. I don't want to see that happen here, regardless of my history with this pack, because I understand better than most exactly how devastating that kind of isolation can become for innocent pack members who have no say in the political maneuvering happening above them." Elena studied Celine carefully throughout this explanation, weighing the woman's words against everything she knew about her calculated nature, and found herself, somewhat reluctantly, believing at least the core substance of what Celine was describing, even if her deeper motivations remained murky and complicated. "What do you suggest we do with this information?" Elena asked directly, the first time she had spoken since Celine's arrival in the council chamber. Celine turned to face Elena for the first time since entering the room, and something passed between them. Not quite reconciliation, but a kind of complicated mutual understanding, between two women who had both, in different ways, been shaped and damaged by the same man's carelessness during that terrible period 18 months earlier. Strengthen your alliances directly, Celine said. Don't wait for Gideon Cross's manipulation to take root. Send representatives to your neighboring territories. Be transparent about the challenges you've faced and the changes you've made since. Let them see for themselves the truth of your current stability, rather than relying on second-hand rumors that Ravenswood can twist to their advantage. The council debated this advice extensively after Celine's departure, ultimately deciding that regardless of her complicated motivations, the strategic wisdom of her suggestion held genuine merit. Over the following months, Elena and Damien embarked on a careful campaign of diplomatic outreach across the region, visiting neighboring territories personally, demonstrating through direct engagement exactly how thoroughly they had addressed the crisis that had once threatened to unravel Blackthorn's stability entirely. These diplomatic efforts brought Elena and Damien into closer, more sustained partnership than they had experienced even during the careful rebuilding of their marriage back in Blackthorn territory, traveling together, presenting a united front to skeptical neighboring Alphas and Lunas, and gradually rebuilding Blackthorn's reputation as a stable, well-governed territory, rather than the vulnerable target Ravenswood's manipulation had attempted to paint them as being. During one such diplomatic visit to Thornfield territory, Elena finally had the opportunity to meet Ivy in person, the childhood friend whose earlier warning had proven so valuable during the Ravenswood crisis in Ashford Vale. "You've built something remarkable here," Ivy observed, watching Elena and Damien work together during a formal council session, their partnership evident in the easy way they consulted each other before finalizing important decisions. "I remember the woman who wrote me that desperate letter, hiding with 2 infants and facing threats from every direction. You seem like an entirely different person now." "I am, in many ways," Elena agreed. "Though I think the person I've become was always somewhere inside me, waiting for circumstances difficult enough to force her forward. I'm grateful, strange as it sounds, for everything that happened, even the painful parts. I don't think I would have discovered my own strength without being forced to survive on my own terms first." The diplomatic campaign proved successful over time, gradually neutralizing Gideon Cross's attempts at political isolation, as neighboring territories witnessed firsthand the genuine stability and effective governance Blackthorn had rebuilt following its earlier crisis. Ravenswood, recognizing that their strategic options had narrowed significantly, eventually redirected their expansionist ambitions toward other, less prepared territories, leaving Blackthorn's borders finally, genuinely secure, for the first time since Elena's original departure, 18 months earlier. Celine did not return to Blackthorn territory after that single formal audience, though occasional reports continued reaching the pack about her efforts to rebuild her own reputation and standing within her family's territory. Elena found herself, somewhat to her own surprise, wishing the other woman genuine success in whatever path she chose to pursue, understanding that they had both, in their different ways, been shaped by the same painful history, and that holding on to continued resentment served no one's genuine well-being at this point. As the second anniversary of that terrible feast approached, Elena found herself reflecting on everything that had changed since the night Damien had stood up in front of the entire pack and humiliated her with calculated cruelty she had never expected from the man she'd married. She thought about the woman she had been that night, quietly devastated but refusing to show it, carrying a secret that would ultimately determine the fate of an entire pack's future. She thought about the months of hiding, the careful preparation, the training and study that had transformed her from a passive political asset into a genuine leader, capable of defending her children and negotiating her own worth from a position of earned strength rather than desperate necessity. And she thought about the partnership she had ultimately built with Damien, imperfect and still requiring continued careful maintenance, but genuine, in ways that surprised her, given how thoroughly he had once failed her. He had proven, through 18 months of sustained, consistent action, exactly the kind of transformation he had promised during their initial negotiations, and while Elena understood that trust, once broken as thoroughly as their marriage had been broken, could never be fully restored to its original innocent state, she had discovered something perhaps more valuable in its place, a partnership built on genuine mutual respect, hard-won understanding, and shared commitment to protecting everything they had worked so carefully to rebuild. 3 years after the night Elena vanished with the pack's future cradled against her chest, Blackthorn Manor prepared for a feast unlike any it had hosted since that terrible evening. And this time, every detail of the celebration reflected exactly how thoroughly the pack had healed from the crisis that once nearly destroyed it. Ren and Ash, now 3 years old, ran through the great hall with the boundless energy of toddlers who had never known anything but security and love, watched over carefully by pack members who had grown to adore the twins during the years since their formal acknowledgement as legitimate heirs. Ren had grown into a fiercely independent child, already showing signs of the strong will and quick intelligence that reminded everyone constantly of her mother's resilience, while Ash displayed a thoughtful, observant nature that suggested he might one day inherit his father's genuine capacity for growth and change, tempered by a natural caution that Elena hoped would serve him well as a future leader. The feast itself had been carefully planned as a celebration of the pack's complete recovery, the border wards fully restored to their original strength for over a year now, Blackthorn's alliances across the region stronger and more genuine than they had been even before the original crisis, and the internal governance of the pack itself transformed into something far more transparent and accountable than the system that had once allowed Damien's careless mistakes to nearly unravel everything. Elena stood at the entrance to the great hall, watching the preparations unfold with a sense of quiet satisfaction that felt entirely different from the anxious tension she remembered from that fateful evening 3 years earlier. She wore deep blue, rather than the pale colors she had favored during her earlier years as Luna, a small but deliberate choice that reflected the confidence and strength she had discovered within herself during the difficult months of exile and rebuilding. "You look like you're remembering something," Damien said, coming to stand beside her, his hand finding hers with the easy familiarity that had gradually replaced the careful distance of their earlier reconciliation. "I am," Elena admitted. "The last time this hall was prepared for a feast this significant, I stood in this exact spot, having no idea my entire life was about to change within the next few hours." Damien's expression grew somber, though he did not flinch from the memory the way he might have during the earlier, more fragile period of their rebuilt partnership. "I think about that night often," he said quietly. "Not with the same shame I carried initially, though the shame never fully disappears. Now I think about it mostly as a reminder of exactly how much I could have lost through my own carelessness, and exactly how grateful I am that you gave me the chance to become someone worthy of what I nearly threw away." Elena squeezed his hand, understanding the genuine weight behind his words, built now on 3 years of consistent action rather than simple apology. "We both changed that night," she said. "Not just you. I discovered strength I never knew I possessed. Strength that has shaped everything about who I am now, as Luna, as a mother, as your partner in leading this pack." The guests began arriving shortly after, pack members from every corner of Blackthorn territory, alongside representatives from neighboring packs, who had once been skeptical allies, but now considered themselves genuine friends, of a territory that had proven its resilience and integrity through the most difficult test any pack could face. Ivy arrived from Thornfield territory, embracing Elena warmly, before making her way to properly meet Ren and Ash for the first time, delighted by the twins' energetic curiosity about their mother's oldest friend. Ruth attended as well, having remained a trusted advisor and healer within Blackthorn territory since Elena's return, watching the celebration unfold with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had helped protect a secret that ultimately saved an entire pack's future. Corinne, too old now to make the long journey from Ashford Vale, had sent a letter that Elena read privately before the feast began, filled with pride and affection for the young woman she had helped transform during those crucial months of hiding and preparation. As the evening progressed, filled with music and laughter, and the genuine warmth of a pack that had rebuilt itself into something stronger and more unified than it had ever been before the crisis, Damien rose to address the assembled guests, and Elena felt a small flicker of tension despite everything that had changed, some part of her still remembering the last time he had stood to make an announcement in this exact hall. But the words that followed carried none of the careless cruelty of that earlier speech. 3 years ago, Damien began, his voice carrying clearly across the great hall. "I stood in this exact spot and made the greatest mistake of my life. I humiliated the woman who had given me everything, who carried within her the true future of this pack, because I was too blind, too careless, and too consumed by my own failures to see the value of what I already possessed. The hall had gone quiet, guests exchanging glances, understanding they were witnessing something significant unfolding before them. That mistake nearly cost us everything, Damien continued. Our borders weakened, our alliances frayed, and I very nearly lost the family that matters more to me than any throne or title ever could. But my wife, my Luna, proved through her own extraordinary strength and resilience that this pack's future was never actually mine to carelessly discard. She protected what mattered most, rebuilt herself into someone I barely recognized when she finally returned to us, and gave me a chance I never deserved to prove that genuine change was possible. He turned to look directly at Elena then, and the sincerity in his expression carried the weight of 3 years of consistent, hard-won trust. Tonight, I want this entire pack to understand exactly what I understand now, he said. This pack's future was never secured by my leadership alone. It was secured by Elena's courage, her wisdom, and her refusal to accept anything less than the respect and partnership she deserved. Whatever strength and stability Blackthorn enjoys today exists because of her, not despite the mistakes I once made. The applause that followed carried genuine warmth and respect, entirely different from the uncomfortable silence that had once greeted Damien's earlier, far more careless announcement in this same hall. Elena felt tears gathering in her eyes, not from sadness but from the overwhelming realization of exactly how far they had traveled together since that painful night 3 years earlier. Later that evening, once the formal celebrations had wound down and the twins had finally been coaxed into bed despite their excitement, Elena stood alone on the balcony overlooking Blackthorn territory, watching the moonlight fall across the forest that had once hidden her escape into an uncertain future. Damien joined her there, wrapping his arm gently around her shoulders, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke, simply watching the peaceful territory spread out before them, safe and secure, in ways that had once seemed impossibly fragile. "Do you ever regret it?" Damien asked quietly. "Everything you went through, all the danger and uncertainty, just to eventually end up back here?" Elena considered the question seriously, thinking about the frightened woman who had fled into the night with 2 infants hidden against her chest, about the months of careful training and preparation in Ashford Vale, about the battle that had nearly cost her everything, and the long, difficult work of rebuilding trust with a husband who had once so thoroughly failed her. "No," she said finally, with genuine certainty. "Every difficult moment taught me something I needed to learn about my own strength and worth. I wouldn't be the woman standing here now, confident in my own capabilities, and genuinely happy in the partnership we've built, without everything that happened. I think, in some strange way, that terrible night at the feast gave me exactly what I needed to become who I was always meant to be." Damien pulled her closer, and Elena leaned into him, feeling the genuine security of a partnership finally rebuilt on honest foundation rather than careless assumption. "Ren and Ash will grow up knowing exactly how strong their mother is," he said softly. "How you protected them, fought for them, and ultimately secured their future through your own courage, rather than simply relying on anyone else to save you. They'll grow up knowing their father found the strength to change too," Elena said. "That mistakes, even devastating ones, don't have to define someone forever, as long as they're willing to do the genuine, difficult work of becoming someone better." Below them, Blackthorn territory stretched out peacefully under the moonlight, its borders secure, its future certain, its pack unified in ways it had never quite achieved even before the crisis that had once threatened to tear everything apart. The story that had begun with such painful humiliation had ultimately transformed into something far more valuable than the comfortable, unquestioned marriage Elena had once accepted, without fully understanding her own worth. She had vanished, with the pack's future once, carrying it to safety through danger and uncertainty that had tested every ounce of strength she possessed. And in returning, on her own terms, with her own hard-won conditions respected completely, she had secured not just her children's legitimate claim to succession, but something far more valuable, a genuine partnership built on mutual respect, earned trust, and the unshakable knowledge of exactly what she was capable of, when everything she loved depended on her own courage and resolve. The Alpha King who had once humiliated her at that terrible feast had finally become the partner she had always deserved, and the future she had once protected alone now belonged to all of them, secure and certain, built on the foundation of everything Elena Voss had proven about herself during the most difficult and transformative months of her life.